First, we want to begin with the slope. And the slope of a line is really just the steepness or the direction it's going. It's either rising or it's running. And by putting those two into our formula, which is right down here, we can figure out the slope. So we can do that with knowing 2 points. So if we look at our first problems over here, we have 2 points, so we can figure out the slope of this line by taking the y-coordinate, and I always take the second one, 4, and we're going to subtract the other y-coordinate, and it happens to be a -1, and still subtract -1, and I'm going to put that over the run, which is taking the same x-coordinate, -2, and subtracting it with the same x-coordinate from the first point. By doing this math, I get 5 over 1, so my slope, and m is used to represent slope, is 5 for that first point. If we take the second one, we can do the same thing, and I'm going to take a -2 minus 4 over a 2 minus a -3. In this case, I get a -6 over 5. And so the slope of this these points happens to be a -6 over 5, and I'm going to leave it just as that. So once again, we want to find our slope. So I'm going to take my y minus my y over my x minus my x value. And in this case, I get 0 on the top. That's a -2. When you have 0, it actually equals 0. So a slope of 0 is like a line, and let me just kind of draw out, is a line that, and if we mark these points, let's just mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 4 is up here, be right in here, and 1, 2, 3, this line is a horizontal line. That means it's a flat line, but it has a slope, and that happens to be 0. Now if we look at this next one, and I go 1 minus 5 and 2 minus 2, we get -4, but we get a 0 in the denominator, and this is a bad thing. So when we have a 0 on the denominator, we don't have a slope, it doesn't exist. And so that kind of problem, if I plot that point to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I go to 1, it happens to be what's called a vertical line. So vertical lines have no slope. There's a difference between no slope and 0, and horizontal lines have 0 slope. So we can use slopes to determine if lines are parallel. That means if they have the same slope, they go in the same steepness, same direction, they're parallel. So I can find the slope of this first 2 points, 2 minus 4 over 3 minus 1, and that gives me a -2 over 2, which is a -1. And if I do the same thing for the other, find the slope of the other point, so I'll go 6 minus 8, and 4 minus 2, I get a -2 over 2, which is a -1. If these two numbers are the same, we have what's called parallel lines. It means if the slopes are equal, we have parallel lines. So now we want to show these types. So let's find the slope of this. So I'll go 6 minus a -9 over 3 minus a -6. So I end up with the slope for the red one is 15 over 9. And then I'm going to do the other 2 points. So I'm going to go 1 minus -8, and I'm going to do -5 minus 10. In this case, it's 9 over, and this happens to be a -15. So when we have slopes that aren't the same, but in this case we have slopes that are, if you look at them, are actually flipping and opposite signs, this is what's called perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines. So when the slopes are the same, they're parallel, but when they're completely the opposite, flipped, they're perpendicular. So these are perpendicular lines because these two slopes, and if you look at it, I'll just write it next to each other, 15 over 9, and then I have -9 over -15. They flipped, so this is called perpendicular. So if we're going to find the slope, let's find the slope of the women's line, and that's 18 0.3 minus 14. There's my y values in 2008 minus 1990. And when I do that, 18.3 minus 14, I get 4.3, and then 2008 minus 1990, I get 18. And if I divide those two, 4.3 and divide by 18, I get 0.24 rounded. So the women have it 0.42. So now let's do the men. So it's 14.7 minus 9 over the same 2008 to 1990, which I already know that's 18. So if I go 14.7 minus 9, I get 5.7. And if I take that and divide that by 18, I get 0.32. So what these slopes mean is this slope means that women increased at 0.24 million living alone, where men increased 0.32. So men living alone has increased over that same time period compared to women. So the steepness of it, or the rate of change, is greater for men. So if we're talking about grades, if you ever see that on a mountain as you're going through and traveling, grades are determined by basically a rate of change or degree of change. In this case, we have a degree of change of 4 feet for every 100. So if we take the 4 and put it over the 100, we get 0.04, which is a 4% grade change, and that's why how they get the answer. So we'll do the same thing here if we have a 5 feet change at every 100 feet. So the part over the total gives us our 0.05, which is 5% grade change, which is, in this case, happens to be a negative because it's going downhill. And we get that because this number is a negative 5 feet as a downgrade.